And today I am speaking with Myron Magnet. He is the author of the new book, Clarence Thomas and the Lost Constitution. I definitely wanted to bring him on today because we all know that the Supreme Court still seems to be one of the most divisive issues in our country right now. In fact, that's probably a big reason why President Trump was elected, so he could nominate and put people on the Supreme Court. And so far, he's put 2 people on there. But Myron has a book on one of the most influential judges probably ever, Clarence Thomas. And Myron, welcome to the show.
Such a pleasure to be with you, Michael.
So I wanted to give you a chance first to talk a little bit about your background. I know you're an author and a historian. Talk a little bit about what else you're into and what you're currently working on.
Well, I ran the City Journal for 14 years or so, and I'm editor-at-large there now. And City Journal was Rudy Giuliani's ideas factory. He held up my magazine once and said, I don't know if you can plagiarize social policy, but this is where I plagiarized mine. And
nice.
Central to our vision for New York was the idea that the first civil right is the right to be safe in your home and in the streets. And that is the purpose of government. There's really no other purpose. It's not to redistribute income. It's not to provide housing. It's not to provide health care. It's simply to keep people safe. And, that led in a kind of inexorable way to my last book, which was called The Founders at Home, and aimed to look at what kind of republic was it that the founders wanted to set up, and what kind of government did they frame to make that happen. And, it was, after reading thousands of pages of their letters and speeches, I came away with this luminous vision of a self-governing republic with a very small government precisely to keep people safe from enemies, internal and external, but otherwise to have a constitution that didn't mean to govern people, didn't mean to rule them. It just meant to protect their right to pursue their own happiness in their own way, in their families and their local communities. And after I had written about that, and journalists, when we got a question, we write a book about it to get the answer. So I got the answer to those questions, but it left me with a further set of questions, which really were, wait a minute, we don't have the founders' government anymore. We don't have the founders' constitution. So how did we lose it, and how do we get it back? And that is what led me to Clarence Thomas, because he's been on the court for 28 years now, and in that time he's written hundreds of opinions that lay out in the most eloquent and coherent way a history of how the framers' Constitution of Liberty got subverted and how we can bring it back. So that's how I got from crime in New York City to our constitutional crisis right now. And I think what you said at the beginning is kind of critical here. You said that you think that the naming of judges was key to President Trump's victory. I agree with you. And I think that a big part of the bitterness of our current politics, I don't know what it's like in Florida, but here in Manhattan where I live, we can hardly speak to each other across the political divide. We're so angry. And I think it's because we have two absolutely incompatible ideas of where the legitimacy of government comes from, of where its authority comes from. So in this crisis of legitimacy, we have the Freedom Party, of which Justice Thomas is perhaps, is certainly the preeminent legal spokesman at this time. And that is the party that views government as resting upon the Constitution of 1787, as improved by the Bill of Rights, perfected by the Reconstruction Amendments after the Civil War, and the 19th Amendment giving women the vote. And it's a constitution of limited government that guarantees liberty and expects self-reliance. On the other side, you can call that the Fairness Party. That's the party that believes in what it was Woodrow Wilson who coined this phrase, believes in the living Constitution,
right?
But believes that it's not this written thing. It's not carved in stone, brought down from the mountain in 1787, but it evolves in order to, in a Darwinian way, said Woodrow Wilson, to adapt to rapidly changing modern conditions. And according to Woodrow Wilson, the judges needed to sit as a kind of permanent constitutional convention making up the laws. And also Wilson's vision for what he called progressivism was this army of Ivy League-trained, supposedly expert, supposedly nonpartisan bureaucrats in independent or executive branch agencies making rules like a legislature, carrying them out like an executive, and adjudicating and punishing infractions of them like a judiciary. So this is a whole, as Franklin Roosevelt admitted when he supersized this system, this is a fourth branch of government that has no basis in the Constitution and has nothing to do with a separation of powers or a limitation, and has kind of run off the rails at this point. And the Fairness Party will tell you, well, but this Constitution, in that it protects workers, minorities, the victims, the powerless, is real democracy because of these protections, which the Constitution of Liberty that allows for inequality of results is not, and we can hardly talk to each other about this. Thomas, as I say, is the legal leader of the Freedom Party, and what he wants to do is sweep away all the accretions that courts have added to that Constitution of Liberty over 100 years or so. And restore it. So what is most radical about Clarence Thomas's jurisprudence is this. He says if the Congress makes a law, President signs it, and we justices believe that it's not constitutional, we don't hesitate to overturn it. Say it's not constitutional, it's not law. So he says, why should we be any more pious toward the errors of our predecessors on this court? It's our duty constantly to look over what we ourselves have done, what our predecessors have done, and say, were we right? And if we weren't, it's our duty to say so, step up to the plate and say, sorry, we made a mistake, and we overturn this. And his great model here is Justice John Marshall Harlan in the case of Plessy v. Ferguson. You remember that was the 1890s case that said that separate but equal facilities for blacks, right, in public accommodation was constitutional. There was only one dissenter, and that was Justice Harlan, who said, our Constitution is colorblind and neither recognizes nor tolerates classes of citizens. The law regards man as man. And Thomas says, this is my model, he says, and what won the day? All these decades later, what do we read? Do we read the majority opinion or do we read the dissent? It's the dissent that won the day. So what Thomas has been doing in now hundreds of opinions over almost 3 decades is to lay out a roadmap for how to get rid of the decisions by which the judges inexorably gave power to the central government and defeated the framers' purpose of a limited government that does nothing more than protect liberty.
And I'm speaking with Myron Magnet. He is the author of the new book, Clarence Thomas and the Lost Constitution. He's also editor-at-large at City Journal. And you were talking about how you have these two different ideas of what government should be, and that's really what has divided us in this country. But I also know in the book that Clarence Thomas, what he believes now, you call him sort of the legal leader of the Freedom Party, that when he was younger, he didn't really believe in that, but he sort of evolved his position into what it is now.
Well, that's really a good point. You know, I wrote this book as a kind of life and works book because I believe that his life sheds light on his jurisprudence in a more than usually close way. I'm sure you know his story, Michael, because he published a memoir, which is terrific, and he was born in a kerosene-lit shanty in a Georgia swamp. So it's not quite a log cabin to White House story, but it is a shanty to high court bench story. Pretty amazing. When he was 7, his mother, now divorced, took him and his little brother to a Savannah slum, and he says after a year of cold and hunger that he just could not get rid of, his mother realized that she couldn't take care of the little boys and sent them to live with her father and stepmother a few blocks away in Savannah, and that was like an Oliver Twist transformation. The grandfather was like a model American self-made man. He was the child of a single mother himself. He wanted to make something of himself, so he founded a little teeny coal and ice delivery business. He converted to Catholicism because he wanted a structured...
And Myron, I just wanted to say this is a very interesting background story when it comes to Clarence Thomas, and I want you to continue that thought in a moment. I'm talking with Myron Magnet, author of the book Clarence Thomas and the Lost Constitution. The Supreme Court, its history and its future. One justice in the Supreme Court right now has definitely affected not only some very important past decisions in the court, but is affecting how we think about the future of the court. That justice is Clarence Thomas. And on that subject, I'm talking with Myron Magnet, who is the author of the new book, Clarence Thomas and the Lost Constitution. And Myron, before we went to break, we were discussing a little bit of Clarence Thomas's background and how he evolved his thinking from, he used to be, I guess, pretty much on the left when it came to a lot of issues, and then changed his mind and became who he is today.
Yeah, well, that's right, Michael, but he actually didn't start out on the left. He was raised, as I was saying before the break, by this very forceful, self-made grandfather, semi-literate, but by the time Clarence Thomas came to live with him, he was running a little fuel oil delivery business, and he would have Clarence and his little brother help him deliver oil after school and on weekends. He sent them to Catholic schools. He expected the greatest effort from them so that they could have coat and tie jobs. He filled them with self-help maxims like where there's a will, there's a way. And in the summers, he took them down to South Georgia to 60 acres that the family owned since after the Civil War, across the road from where their ancestors had been enslaved. And he and the two boys built with their own hands a cinder block house and cleared the land and tilled the fields. And every summer they would grow crops, raise livestock, and so they'd have food in the freezer and in the cupboard for the winters in Savannah. So this was a guy who learned self-reliance by relying on himself. This was a pioneer-like existence designed partly to keep him away from street culture, which his grandfather really feared, and, of course, largely to instill this idea of self-reliance. And this is a big theme of Justice Thomas's in the speeches he gives, which are terrific, and of which, people say he's very silent, but he's talked a lot. And what he says is, look, we think everything is done with the laws. It isn't, he says. It's all done in here, he says, tapping his heart. It's done with what we most deeply believe. In order to have a self-governing free republic, you need free citizens capable of self-reliance, such as he was brought up to be, and you can't have those kind of citizens unless you have a culture that breeds those individuals, that nurtures those individuals, so that the culture we have now, with all the bellyaching about victims and victimology and large forces that push you around and that you can't control your fate in the face of, and you're not responsible for where you end up in life, that's a lot of hogwash to him, and it's dangerous not only to the individual, who therefore won't take responsibility for making himself all that he could be, but it's dangerous for the society, because you don't have these self-governing people. Now, you're absolutely right that he did experience really, really extreme racism, not in growing up in his segregated Catholic school, but he was going to be a priest. He went to a seminary in St. Louis where he really felt it. By the time he got to Holy Cross as an undergraduate, he had moved left, and he was, as he says, an angry black man, seeing racism everywhere. And in his junior year in college, the very end of his junior year, he went to a demonstration in Harvard Square that to support our black political prisoners, meaning Black Panther murderers. And that demonstration, which a friend of mine saw and says, it's as bad as Thomas says it was, it turned into a riot. Businesses were burned and destroyed. Cops were beat up. There were injuries. There was lots of property damage. Hundreds of people were involved. The next morning, back at Holy Cross, Thomas went into the chapel and prayed to God to be relieved of his anger over racism. And he asked himself, do I really believe in Mr. Jefferson's founding idea that all men are created equal and endowed with rights? And he said, yeah, I do. Do I believe this is an opportunity society? Yeah, I do. And so that's when he began his steady move to conservatism, but it wasn't a new thing with him, because even though his grandfather was a lifelong Democrat and a enthusiastic member of the NAACP, those maxims, where there's a will, there's a way, there's no such thing as can't, that is conservatism, whatever political party you belong to. That idea of individual responsibility for your own fate and the ability to overcome adversity and to have opportunity and make the most of it, that is conservatism. So Thomas moved more and more and more to the right, as he saw in Holy Cross and then at Yale Law. Affirmative action, which was getting into full swing in his day, was doing nobody any good, because it was putting black kids into schools a rank or two above where they could excel. And so they were failing and becoming resentful and angry and thinking of themselves as victims. For kids like him who really could do the work, it branded them with a kind of imputation of inferiority. So Thomas says he couldn't get a job when he graduated from Yale Law. So what good was affirmative action doing people? So he went to work for the Attorney General of Missouri, John Ashcroft. And when Ashcroft became a senator, he went to Washington with Ashcroft. And, as they say, the rest is history. He came to the attention of the Reagan administration. He went to work in the federal bureaucracy, so when he writes about the administrative state, he was in it for well over a decade, and he knows whereof he speaks. He knows that as far as the plight of black Americans is concerned, there's nothing that the government can do. It's now, he said what the 1964 Civil Rights Act did is stop stopping us. And now it's up to black Americans to make their own fate and join the mainstream. And what he calls so-called black leaders are not helping by stressing victimology, victimology, victimology.
I'm speaking with Myron Magnet, who is editor-at-large at City Journal, also author of the book Clarence Thomas and the Lost Constitution. So let's go into a little bit of some of his legal thinking. In the book, you talk about how the court has changed over the years and how it's changed how we think of the Constitution and laws over the years. Talk a little bit about that, and then how Clarence Thomas is trying to go back to the Constitution.
Well, yeah, Michael, that's a great question. He sees the subversion of the original framers' Constitution of Liberty is happening in three stages. The first one is very little known, and that is that after the Civil War, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were intended to give black citizenship and clothe them with all the rights of the Bill of Rights against incursion by state governments, right? So to protect their life, liberty, and property against state governments. And particularly it was one clause in the 14th Amendment that does this. Now, the whole country is sitting on the edge of its chair after this to see how is the Supreme Court going to interpret the 14th Amendment. And in two 1870s decisions, the court said, wait a minute, these don't mean what you think they mean. No, these are not the rights that belong to black citizens. The rights that we're talking about are the rights to travel on interstate waterways or not to be subject to bills of attainder. So basically his own court, to his everlasting shame, guts the 14th Amendment. And Thomas says these are shameful decisions. And why are we respecting them? Why don't we just say, you know what, our forebears on the court made a terrible mistake, and we overturn these two rulings, Slaughterhouse and Cruikshank of 1873.
And this is a very important topic dealing with the future of the Supreme Court, not only the past, but the future of the Supreme Court. I've been speaking with Myron Magnet, author of the book Clarence Thomas and the Lost Constitution. And like I said, the Supreme Court's still a divisive issue in the country today. There are some who feel like the court has gone too far astray from its original purpose, which is interpreting the Constitution as written. One of those people is on the court, Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas. Right now, I'm speaking with basically an expert on Clarence Thomas, and he has a new book out, Clarence Thomas and the Lost Constitution. Myron Magnet joins me once again. And Myron, in the last segment, you were talking about how there's different phases of how the court got lost and how we can restore it to its original constitutional purpose. I'll let you continue on with what you were saying.
Oh, thanks. Okay, so the first one is the subversion of the 14th Amendment. And what Justice Thomas says is, okay, the court came up with a workaround in the New Deal called substantive due process, which is a dangerous legal fiction because it makes judges make up law. He says, let's just junk that and overrule Slaughterhouse and Cruikshank and go back to the original understanding of the 14th Amendment, which is to clothe freedmen in all the rights against incursions by the states. He says, because after all, those two Supreme Court rulings led to 90-plus years of Jim Crow in the South. And he says, I grew up in Savannah under this. This is personal with me, right? I know all about government oppression, and we should not conspire in this. We should just say the court made a mistake. The amendment was right. Enough of that. Now, so the second act is Woodrow Wilson and his living Constitution, and the huge expansion under Franklin Roosevelt of the administrative state. The idea that all these experts, the fourth branch of government, the FTC, the SEC, now the EPA and the PCAOB, that all these agencies can rule us in effect, and one of the things that is so ironic to me is that Woodrow Wilson, in being the theorist of all this, as the heart of his so-called progressivism, thinks of all of this as super modern, as an advance over those antique and benighted founding fathers who were Newtonian, whereas he is Darwinian. But who was his model? His model was the Prussian king Frederick the Great and his enlightened despotism, right? And he read all the philosophers who were kind of the apologists for Frederick the Great. And the thing about enlightened despotism is that enlightenment always evaporates, leaving only despotism behind. And by the way, how can it be more modern to have an idea of government that is about being ruled, however wisely, as opposed to being a self-governing republic? I mean, that's just amazing to me.
Yeah, even in the big scheme of history.
Disgusting to Clarence Thomas, right? So in a whole series of 2015 rulings, Thomas calls into question the whole structure of the administrative state. He says it has no comfortable home in our constitutional structure, and he begins chipping away at its legitimacy, and I think that he's going to be followed in this by Judges Kavanaugh and Gorsuch for sure, and Justice Alito already doesn't like the administrative state. So I think that the court is going to be headed in the right direction in this respect. The third of these great movements of subversion of the framers' Constitution of Liberty was the Warren Court and its idea that you could just make up rights out of thin air. And actually, Justice Thomas wrote an article about this for my magazine back in 1994. And what do? You have the court making up rights of, let's say, gangbangers to hang out menacingly on corners in Chicago, or the rights of students first to free speech in school, but then to misbehave in school. And if they get disciplined by their teachers or principals, they can sue them personally, right, for invading their constitutional rights, or the rights of tenants in public housing projects not to be evicted for dope dealing, let's say, or making horrible disturbances without a full court hearing, which in practice is too complicated and too expensive to do to expel anybody. So he says, first of all, these rights have no basis in the Constitution whatsoever, and there's a whole string of decisions or a whole string of opinions in which he lays forth why these rights just don't exist, are not constitutional. But then he says, how would the justices who believe that these should be rights like to live in a community where these rights are obtained? He says, well, I can tell you, they've created just such a society in our inner city communities in America. So just take a look at the real practical effects on real lives on the ground. You have kids who are afraid to walk to school because the streets are dangerous with gangbangers. He says, in Chicago, in this case that he was talking about with the rights of gangbangers, he says, we know that these guys have committed 200 murders a year on average for a decade. The kids are right to be afraid. Then they get to schools where teachers and principals can't discipline them because of rights created by justices. So they can't learn anything. And for those few like him or Thomas Sowell who really want to learn something, they then get home to their housing projects, which are pandemoniums, because nobody can exert any civil order there. So it's too noisy to study. So how can they learn anything? How can they become self-supporting members of the community and thoughtful citizens to carry out their civic duties in later life? We are condemning them by finding these rights to failure. And he says, and if the law does not distinguish between right doing and wrongdoing, how is anybody going to learn the difference between right and wrong? So all these phony laws created by the court or validated by the court, as in the case of the way the New Deal got hold of the whole economy, we, the court, have to overturn them. And just a couple of weeks ago, he actually wrote the majority opinion for the court in a complicated tax jurisdiction case. But the important point is that he and the majority, in the last paragraph of this decision, say, oh, by the way, this whole case turns on a precedent that is wrong, and we hereby overturn it.
Wow.
So the court is going in his direction, and now, after all these years, up until even 10 years ago, when he was looked at as this kook out in right field, even the smartest law professors like Akhil Amar, who are obviously guys on the left, are now looking at him as this very serious legal thinker with a coherent, consistent, highly intellectual jurisprudence that has to be taken very seriously.
Yes, and Myron Magnet, really appreciate you coming on the show today. His new book, Clarence Thomas and the Lost Constitution, and how Clarence Thomas, like he said there, is changing the court for the better. Myron, like I said, I really appreciate you coming on the show, and we'll get you on the show again sometime in the future.
Michael, thank you. I enjoyed it so.
All right, available anywhere that books are available, Amazon.com, any bookstores.